Welcome back to Builders of the Broken Bazaar. I'm your host again, Dr. Tabish Zaman. Leadership is the flavor today. Authentic leadership, which is a very integral part of entrepreneurship. But it's very easy to talk about leadership when life is very smooth. The harder question is, what does leadership look like when the system itself is struggling? In the UK today, nowhere it is clearer than the NHS, the National Health Service. Public confidence has eroded so sharply that only about 1 in 5 people now believe the health services is well run. And in a recent survey, 3/4 of the adults, they feared they'd be failed if they go to any accident and emergency. Long waits, it's all about not enough beds, or simply about that care they wouldn't be there when it's needed. Now, this is not just a service issue, it's a crisis of leadership and credibility. Because when people no longer believe the system can sustain them, what does it mean to lead inside it? What kind of leadership shows up when the ground beneath is shaking or is unstable? My guest today, and I'm so proud of that, my guest today is Dominic Morgan. He has walked directly into those pressures, serving as an NHS commissioner during some of the most challenging years of UK healthcare, leading reforms in public services, and now working globally as the chief executive officer of ReThink Crisis, and also the founder of Authentic Leaders Institute. Dominic's philosophy is simple. Now, some might call it radical, but he believes leadership isn't about performance. It's all about practice. It's not what you project in good times, but how you show up when there is a storm outside. Dominic, welcome to Builders of the Broken Bazaar.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's a real privilege to be here.
Now, before we dive into your NHS work and your current leadership thinking or perspective, I really want to take a step back because I believe none of us arrive into leadership as a ready-made individual. It's usually a journey of learning, unlearning, and sometimes trying to break that mold of what we thought leadership should be. So my very first question to you is, was there a moment in your life when you realized that very textbook model of leadership, which we all learn, didn't actually work?
Yes, there was. I have to go back some time. I'm 61 years old now, so I have to go back to when I was 18. And it's quite a long story, so I'll try to keep it short. I was in an army jail waiting to be prosecuted for committing an act of war and for stealing an army vehicle and leaving it in a different country. And I didn't like what I was being told. I was 18 years old. I've always been a bit of a rebel, but more importantly, I've always felt a particular drive to confront injustice, and that's what sort of led me to that position in the first place. But then I was told that I was looking at potentially 2 years in a civilian prison, that the army would discharge me and I would go into a civilian prison. And given who I was, I didn't like that. I didn't like what I was being told, so I broke out of jail. And what I mean by that is that myself and another, because I needed two people, we were locked in our cells at the end of the day, and they checked on us at 10 o'clock and 10:30, and then after that, they never checked on us. And then when they came to wake us up at 6 o'clock in the morning, we were 300 miles away, and they couldn't work it out. They just couldn't work it out. They worked out some aspects of it. They just couldn't work out how this had happened. And in the army in particular, they don't like it. They don't like it if you abscond from their jail. They don't like that. So we were caught 3 days later and returned. And they make a point of returning you to where you've broken out of, because they want to send a message to everyone that you'll get caught eventually, and you will eventually. And that led really to a complete change in the way the army dealt with me. And effectively, I went in front of the brigadier of the corps, who was the sort of highest ranking officer, and he demanded, he wanted to know how I done it, and he said to me, bluff or not, I don't know, I was 18 years old. He said to me, Private Wilson's been in front of you, and he's told us all that it was your plan and your idea. So tell us, what happened. And I had already, by now, I'd already decided that the army was going to get rid of me anyway because of what I'd done. So I really didn't hold anything back. I just told the truth. I just said, well, this is, it was my plan, and this is, I needed someone else, and this is how I did it. And I remember this brigadier sat on his chair looking at me for about 10 minutes, not saying a word, kept looking down at my records, which were quite substantial by that stage, I have to say, even at 18, and kept looking at me. And then at the end of this 10-minute silence, and I had the regimental sergeant major one side and the RP sergeant on the other side, who both did not like me because I'd broken out of their jail. And he just basically said, if you use your real brains for military matters, you'll be higher ranked and better paid. We're keeping him, marching out, Sergeant Major. And that's effectively what happened. They took me out, took me back to the jail, and after a couple of weeks of being in England, they put me on a plane with two guards, basically took me in handcuffs and flew me back to Germany, which is where I'd come from. And I was bemused by it all, really, on one level. And what happened was they kept moving me around, and I ended up in 10 Corps RCT barracks in the jail there. And I genuinely thought they had forgotten about me because I was there for so long, and nobody had come to see me, nothing, and I thought they'd forgotten about me. And then what happened was my adjutant at the time, which is an officer that's responsible for discipline within your battalion, came to see me and sat on the end of my bed. And I remember him looking at me and said, do you want to go? Do you want to stay in the army? Now, at that stage, I have to be honest, I hadn't. I'd learned enough already that I didn't want to stay, but I wasn't stupid either. And I knew it was a loaded question. So I said, yes, I'd like to stay in the army. And they said, well, tomorrow you're going to go in front of your CO, which is your commanding officer, and he can only give you 24 days. That's the maximum he can give you. He cannot give you 2 years, cannot send you for court-martial. He said, if you ask to go to court-martial, and he will ask you that question, he said, they will send you to court-martial, and he wants to send you to court-martial. Because when I left a load of officers sat outside the officers' mess waiting for their transport, and that never turned up because by then it was somewhere in another country. And so I sort of looked bemused at him, and he said, we've kept you for 79 days. On the 79th day, we should have charged you or released you. Tomorrow will be the 80th. So therefore, they cannot send you for court-martial. And if you accept his award, you'll get 24 days. And that's exactly what happened. I won't go into detail where they sent me and why, but the reality is I realized at a very young age that the rules that you're told, they're made up, really. They can bend them. And and this wasn't bending them, this was breaking their own rules. They broke their own rules to keep me, which at a young age had a real profound effect on me. It was like watching someone being bullied and realizing that although you weren't being bullied, and I've never been bullied, I've had a lot of people try, but I've never been bullied. It didn't make it right. It didn't make it right that the rules were being bent and broken. And it was a really profound lesson on me, and I learned that really early. And that lesson has stood me in really good stead for my whole career, really.
So that environment within which obviously you interacted with so many different people above you, you were only 18 years old. So we can take away the fact that that's the environment which shaped your understanding of what it really means to be led, because today you're all about that.
Yeah, I mean, it was a first. I mean, it was a first lesson really, and about that leadership is not entirely defined as you think it is. We're not. It's a hierarchical system in the military. It's a hierarchical system in the UK, but it's not alone. It's reflected across the world. But the reality is that People are making these rules up that you have to follow, but they can break them as quick as they like. And that is a really profound lesson for an 18-year-old to learn. Like I said, it's stood me in good stead throughout my whole career, because when someone tells me it can't be done, my answer is there's no such thing as can't. There is just no such thing as can't.
So we can say that it was a personal crisis, wasn't it, when you were 18? I mean, going through this entire ordeal, you learned so many different elements of leadership, I believe.
Yeah, I learned very quickly that just because someone stands above you, just because someone occupies a space which seemingly is above you, doesn't make them any cleverer than you. It doesn't make them any better than you. You know, there's nobody in this shared reality that has any more rights than anyone else. Nobody. And on one level, if you look at it, if you stand back and look at it, that's all this is. You know, we live in a shared reality, and that shared reality is applied to all of us, and all of us will have an opinion whether that's applied fairly, whether there's justice within the system. And I suspect all of us will come to a conclusion that there isn't justice in the system. But there is nothing at the beginning of our journey within this shared reality that says that we have any more rights than anyone else. And when you look at it, when you realize that as a lesson, you realize that at a young age as a lesson, it makes you look at things very, very differently. And it made me look at things very, very differently.
So does it take a crisis? Does it take a really harsh lesson for someone to, because when you're 18, you're really not thinking unless you're going through that experience. So now you're 61. If you reflect back, which you have been, so does it take a crisis for an individual to learn some of the tenets of leadership and understand what it takes to stand up to people who are above you or who hold position or power above you?
Well, I think many people go on many different journeys. They do, that's the reality of it. But what I found is that I left school with 2 GCSEs, both Ds. I don't have an education. I don't come from a university background. Every lesson I've learned has been the hard way, has been the reality of doing it. And I've been very, very fortunate. I mean, I know many people that say to me, you should write a book. And sometimes when I look at my own life, I genuinely think, is this true? Did this really happen? But the reality is I know it did because I lived it. And what I found through that journey is that there were opportunities to step up. There were opportunities that were created for me or I created myself. And every time those opportunities created was because I followed my own values. I followed what I believed, not what I was told to believe. And that's one of the fundamental lessons that if you want to be a leader, the difference between management and leadership is that management works within a space that is created around them. So you're told, these are your objectives, these are your aims, these are your people, these are the resources that you have, and you have to manage within that space. In leadership, there is no space. In leadership, you create that space. You decide where the boundaries are. And often I found throughout my whole career that my idea of the boundaries is completely different from everyone else's around me, particularly those who would like to hold me within boundaries. But I felt a natural instinct to be able to push against that and say, no, just because you tell me that doesn't make it right. It doesn't make it right. And I know because I can go back to when I was 18 and give you a fundamental lesson that I learned that it doesn't make it right.
And you learned it very early on, isn't it? From an 18-year-old man to now leading systems inside one of the most difficult of the environment. And what I'm talking about is now getting into the NHS, the National Health Service, because it's a place where obviously it impacts people's lives down here. And we also see how resources are so stretched out. Because crisis, I feel, having worked in the NHS for this long or understand NHS this long, you understand it's not an exception. It's a day-to-day occurrence. So coming to the question, what did leadership look like for you as a commissioner within the NHS? What's the journey was all about?
Well, I have to go back. So leadership for me started really at a very young age. I remember having a conversation with my sister only a year ago, my younger sister, and I was talking about leadership, and she said to me something which I had never realized. She said to me, "You were always leading." You were always the one that said, let's do this, let's do that, let's do this. Often getting into trouble. I had a large families of 6 brothers and sisters, often getting into trouble. But the reality is it was always me going, let's do this. And I'd never really thought of it like that. I'd never really, because you don't look at yourself like that. And it was only when my sister sort of reflected that back to me, I was like, oh, okay. And then I realized actually in every environment that I'd been in, I had always attempted to lead. And in many of those cases, I was successful. So when I was in the army, even though I left as a private under, not the best of circumstances, it wasn't because I didn't lead, and it wasn't because I wasn't potentially a good soldier. It was the opposite. Is that actually I found these things quite easy. I genuinely found it quite easy. But what I found in the army, in the military in particular, was an organisation that really shaped my views about values. Because what it did was it tried to impose its values on me. And what I saw around me was that process. I saw people coming in and their values changing and the values of the organisation being forced on it. It made me realise at quite a young age that our values are not necessarily ours. Mm-hmm. They're not our values. Mm-hmm. So when we look at organisations like the NHS, I've been in many rooms and listened in many meetings and been in many circumstances where people are telling me something, and it's not their values that they're telling me. It's what they've been told to tell me, or it's what they believe that they should tell me. And it's not the right answer. And then when you have values placed on you that are someone else's, if you think about it, when you're born, your first values come from your parents. That's where they come from. And then you get some influence from your siblings. And as you go through your life, it depends on where you work, it depends on the organisations you're in, it depends on the nature of their values. And before you know it, you don't know what your values are. Yeah. If I was to sit there and say to you, write your values out, just write them out, you would struggle a bit. You would sit there and go, well, hang on a minute, are these my values? Or are they my school's values? Or are they my parents' values? What are my values? And one of the things that we teach in leadership is that process, is to say, recognize yourself first. And I know from my experiences right across, way before the NHS, right across my experiences in the fire service. I joined the fire service in 1991, and it was really the first time where I felt my skill set had found a home, and I started to lead, really because of necessity. One of the first things I saw when I joined the fire service was I saw our standard of response when it came to road traffic collisions, and I wasn't happy. I really wasn't happy with it. We didn't have the right equipment, and we had a very forward-thinking Chief Fire Officer, John Craig, who managed to get equipment for us, and I was very grateful for that, because it gave us the impetus to start looking at things differently and start training differently. But we took on, myself and another firefighter, took on the training locally to make ourselves better, because actually where we were stationed was on the A303, which is a really big road, and most people wouldn't know where we are. We're in Amesbury. They might know because of the Novichok poisoning, but really we were the closest town to Stonehenge. And that is a really significant road that runs to the West Country. And we were the second busiest station in the county of Wiltshire when it came to road traffic collisions. So we needed to upskill and we needed to get better. And that didn't come from the top. It came from us. It came from us at the station level. And really it came from my view, and Jason's view was with me, of we're not good enough. We're not good enough. We can't hide behind this. We're talking about people's lives here. We're not good enough. So we made a change. We started to train people locally, what we call targeted training, to get better. We took the leadership role because it wasn't there. We were talking about people's lives. And then at a later stage, I joined the ambulance service and became a technician, and then ultimately a paramedic. And before I ever became a commissioner, and then I moved up the ranks within the ambulance service, ultimately being the operations manager in Wiltshire. So I was responsible for Wiltshire, Swindon, and Bath and North East Somerset, so delivering the 999 service in those areas. And all of that was really about me seeing the space and me applying my values and saying, no, something has to be done. Something has to be done about this, and stepping into that space and taking it. None of it was because somebody led me there. None of it was because somebody told me that it needed doing. I could see that for myself. So I think I got promoted 4 times in 4 years in the ambulance service up to running it. And the reality is what I saw was that there were many good people inside the NHS. I was looking at it specifically from an ambulance perspective in that stage. But what I saw was their hands were tied behind their backs. They didn't understand what leadership was. They didn't have the support to be able to step outside of their roles and really push the NHS forward, which is what the NHS ultimately needs. It needs true leadership. And if somebody was to ask me what is the biggest single problem in the NHS, I would say leadership. It's as simple as that.
So, in terms of your own experience of being under pressure, and again within the NHS or whether within the fire services, was there an interplay of your values or the values you were assigned to? And of course, given the circumstances within which these organizations operate, there are pressures as well. So when it collides, the pressure and the value, again, you're an apt individual to talk about it. How did you negotiate that?
Well, I think right from the beginning, the only reason I genuinely became one of the managers in the ambulance service is I was very critical. I was a union rep, and I was very critical of what I saw. Very critical, in particular because the ambulance service at the time was really an old boys network, and it needed to change. It needed to be fair, and there needed to be justice. People needed to be promoted on their abilities, not on their time served, and not on their friends. And that was really where I was very vocal. And actually, was somebody said to me, "Well, if you think you can do better, why don't you do it?" And I said, "Okay." And that's exactly what I did. And I applied my values throughout. And I literally applied my values every step of the way. So if I thought somebody was good enough, if I thought somebody had the skill set, they might not have had the experience, but that I could teach them. They could be trained. That wasn't the issue. The issue was, did they have the right approach in the first place? Did they have the right qualities? What we call personal qualities and attributes? Did they have that? And if they had that, then why would they not get on? Why would they not be part of the solution? So that's what I followed through all the way through my whole career, really, was if somebody was good enough, if somebody could bring something to the table, then that was part of leadership, was recognizing that and allowing those people to succeed. It wasn't me. I didn't, with the best win in the world, it wasn't me. I didn't do it. I genuinely didn't, get the ambulance out quicker. I didn't, make the staff feel like they were more part of the team. What I did was I created the conditions for that. I created the space and allowed people to step into that space and empower them to do so. And once you do that, it doesn't matter what you're dealing with, you will find that the solutions will present themselves. So my major experience when it came to applying my values was really in disaster response. I found myself in the Boxing Day tsunami, 2004, we were going to put a team together and send a team out from Wiltshire of firefighters and paramedics, and we got put in touch with somebody that was sending doctors. So we diverted our resources and our support to helping them, and that's how I met a friend of mine called Shani Rashid, and that was the right thing to do. It was the right thing to do because it was a higher grade. So it was my value again, saying, our values were. It's not right to go there just for the sake of going there. If there are other people better qualified, let's support them and get them out. It was a horrendous, situation at Boxing Day tsunami in 2004. And then I remember I was going into my house and with my family, and I had a phone call, and it was from Shani, and he said, "Have you seen the news?" And I hadn't seen the news, and for some reason I said, "Yes," and he was like, not knowing really what he was referring to, and quickly trying to put Sky on, and found that we were talking about the Kashmir earthquake in 2005. And Shani said, and I said, "Oh, are you going to send a team?" Because I had been up there and supported them, giving them some advice about what to take and things like that. And he said, "No." He said, "Yeah, we're going to send a team." And I said, "Okay." I said, "What do you want? What support do you want?" He said, "Well, I want you to go in it." And I was like, "Really?" And I was put really on the spot, and I wasn't expecting it. I really wasn't expecting it. So I had to question my own values very quickly because I had two employers, and I did say that. I said, I've got two employers. I work for the fire service and I work for the ambulance service. I work for the ambulance service full time, and when I'm at home, I'm on call for the fire service. So I had to make it really clear that they had to give me permission to go, thinking genuinely at that stage that was quite a hurdle to get over anyway. Both of them very graciously and recognising the scale of the situation said, yeah, released me to go. So before I had time even to think, I found myself on a plane flying into Islamabad, being the only white non-Muslim on the plane, and questioning myself as to how did I get here? And we arrived on day 5 in the ground up in the affected region of Kashmir, and it was on a scale that is really difficult to describe. And I ended up, and people used to say to me when I came back, what was it like? And the truth is, people ask you that question, but they don't really want to know the detail. They don't want to know some of the things I had to do. But I ended up describing it with one word, and that was biblical, because just the scale of it was so big. It was so many, 80,000 people were killed, 150,000 were injured, 3 million were made homeless, all in 5 minutes, which is really difficult to sort of recognise the scale of that afterwards. And I remember what happened was we went up, took us 12 hours to get up there, and it was a massive traffic jam trying to get resources into Kashmir, into the foothills and the Himalayas. And I remember that we set up camp, and it was really precarious where we set up because there were nowhere, because everyone was taking this whatever space they could, because of course nobody wanted to go back in the buildings. And the truth where we were, and pretty much the whole region, there were no buildings to go back into. I mean, even the main hospital was leaning and cracked, and nobody could go inside the main hospital. And when I say the main hospital, I'm talking about up in Kashmir. We're not talking about a hospital that we'd expect to see or with the resources that we would expect in England or in Britain. So it was a really difficult scenario. And I remember that we had circumstances where the army were ordered to go back into the mosques and clear the mosques to give the people some sort of semblance of normality. And when they went in to do that, one of the mosques collapsed on them, and they were literally 400 or 500 yards from us. So they were brought to us. This soldier was brought to us, and he was completely unconscious, bilaterally, had to be cannulated. We didn't have an output at all, but we managed to get an output on him, but we had to breathe for him. So in those circumstances, it was very difficult. So we had to find somewhere for him to go, because what we knew was that he had internal bleeding. So he had abdominal bleeding, and we knew that. And we had to get him, knowing that the only solution for him was an operating theatre. And we managed to get to what was the old brigade headquarters, which was down the road, about 2 or 3 kilometres down the road. And eventually we confirmed that he had an output, and then we got him into a vehicle, and we managed to keep breathing for him. We managed to get him somewhere to the only operating table in the region, which was on the back of a truck, and it only had one ventilator. So he was operated on, and unfortunately, because he was only on one ventilator, he was taken off the ventilator, and he was bag and mask. And as a doctor, you'll know that that's not an efficient way to keep someone alive, and he didn't make it. But during that sort of whole episode, there was a point where it was quite heated inside this tent inside the brigade headquarters, and there was a Spanish firefighting team with a Spanish doctor there. And the next day we went back. We had another patient, because now we knew there was this referral route that we could use. So we took another patient back. And after we dealt with what we dealt with, I took the opportunity to go and see this doctor and apologise to him for how it had been heated the day before. I mean, it wasn't me, but I was apologising on behalf of someone else to say, I'm really sorry, that if it felt like it was. And he was very gracious, this Spanish doctor, and said, no. Anyway, we got chatting about where he came from and how long he was going to be there. And it turned out they were leaving the next day. And my first reaction was, well, who's going to crew this? Who's going to be here? Who's going to manage this? And his answer was, well, why don't you come here? Why don't you come here? You take over from us. And we had to go and see the major, and he only asked one question: "Are we going to work hard?" Of course, I laughed, but we said yes, we're going to work hard, and that was it. We took over. So, and it was a poor state, and my values are that we can't work in those sort of circumstances. There were things that were unacceptable when it came to sharps, when it came to infection control. So I organised it, and the next day the president of Pakistan came, and in the middle of all this madness, made me an honorary Pakistani because we had come to help. But we managed to set this up and become the first true helicopter evacuation centre in the region. And I remember at one stage with the Pakistani military, we had bulldozed the rest of the buildings out of the way so we could get more helicopters. And at one stage we had 8 helicopters landing and taking off at the same time. They were bringing supplies, and I would commandeer them. We would literally commandeer these helicopters and make them fly to Rawalpindi and Islamabad, the main teaching hospital, and send our patients out. And it worked. It worked. But it all came from that value of thinking somebody had been upset, and I didn't like that. So just stepping in to say, I'm going to make a point of dealing with that now, led to that. Led to the helicopter evacuation centre for the whole region and the effect it had on the patients.
So in that whole situation, talking individually of yourself as an individual, did you see yourself coming out of that, detaching yourself from that whole episode of how long you spent there and with the people you spent the time with? Did you see yourself evolve as an individual, especially in terms of leadership, coming back into a normal circumstances to what you went in?
Absolutely. I mean, many people. I remember I was asked that question when I came back. Do you think it made you a better paramedic? And I said, undoubtedly. Those experiences make you a better clinician when you're dealing with some of the things we dealt with. And it was really a horrendous situation. But what I said actually was, more importantly, I hope it makes me a better human being. Because what you see and where you draw the lines of where you have to step in and what needs to be done. It's without going into the level of detail that experience had, it was significant. And it's always been, in a sense, my approach it's always been that we have to learn. We just have to learn, and we have to get better at what we're doing. It doesn't matter the circumstances. And I took that approach into the NHS. I took that as a paramedic, all through my role, even my leadership roles, all the way through to commissioning, which was, I've been asked many times about the NHS and what the problems are with the NHS, and I've been very, very clear about it. Very, very clear. I put nailed my colours to the mast right from the beginning. That the significant issue about the NHS is leadership, and what we need is a model of the NHS which is going to recognise that quality is not a desired outcome; it is the answer. The sooner you can provide quality in the patient journey, the better off the patient is, the better the clinician feels about their patient, and the more cost effective it is, and the more cost effective your service is. What we've got now is a service in crisis, and it's crisis to a level where there are no answers. So when I was a commissioner, one of the things that I was brought in to do was to take control of the local health economy in Bath and North East Somerset, the daily control of it, because it was just chaos. It was chaos. So you had lots of organisations pointing the fingers at each other, saying, it's your fault. Ambulance services bringing too many patients, or we're waiting for social services to do assessments, and not recognising that they were all in the same boat. I mean, particularly the hospital was the biggest voice within the daily system, and because of that, they felt that they had the right to demand action from other people. And what's often the case is that people couldn't provide the answers because there wasn't the answers. You can't create another ward just like that. You can't train another 50 staff members. It takes years to train people to become in those roles. And I found some really, really fundamental problems. I remember the first time I ever sat there and questioned the hospital about its model for determining its bed size, its bed base. And I said, what model are you using? And effectively, the answer I got was, there isn't a model. We've got our own, and everyone else has got their own. Which it doesn't take a rocket scientist to realise that even if one is right, The rest are all wrong. And the reality is, people were making decisions on commissioning level about bed bases and about services which couldn't be justified, really couldn't be justified. And people on a daily basis were all using their own languages. They were all literally coming up with their own criteria about why they're in black or why they're in red or why they're in amber. And there was literally nothing. There was nothing. And I remember my boss said to me, because I said to them when I was brought on, and they asked me, could I deal with this challenge? And I said to them, give me 2 weeks. I said, give me 2 weeks and I'll give you the answer. And I remember 2 weeks later, I took back a document and I had written, and I called it, and I said, what you need to do is to put in place an operational performance management framework where everyone is talking the same language, everyone is using the same metrics, and the metrics are not decided
Sorry,
by...
could you repeat that again? Because that got cut out, because that's a very important point you're mentioning,
Okay.
operation.
So everyone was using this. So an operational performance management framework is basically saying to everyone else, lots of disparate partners who have their own idea about it, and saying, right, you're no longer going to dictate how we measure this. We're going to measure it together. We're going to measure it with one measure. We're going to have one matrix that says what is amber, what is red, what is black, what is green. We're going to have one language, and that language is going to be produced for everyone. So we would have a daily, before there was a monthly dashboard that said how services were behaving. We scrapped that straight away, and we went straight to daily. We said, no, we need to understand daily what is happening within our services. And probably the reality is we need to happen in real time. But that's the best that we could get. So we would demand that all the services would provide data into the system, and we commissioned the BIU, the Business Intelligence Units, and the RUH to produce a dashboard. And it came out by 11 o'clock. And by that time, looking at that dashboard, we could then make a decision about what was required to support the system. So did the system require a telephone conference call with all of the major players? And could we then determine what action we could take? And I remember who later became my boss, but she was one of my senior managers in the CCG. And I remember her saying to me, "Where did you get this from?" And I sort of looked at her a bit surprised. And I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "Well, where did you get this from?" And I went, "Well, I wrote it, Tracy. I just wrote it. It was obvious. The answer was staring you in the face. If you step back long enough and you remove the restrictions of leadership from you and just look at it and say, this is the problem, okay? There are no restrictions on the answer. The answer was obvious. So, and I remember I gave it to the NHS and one of their consultants, and I remember it took them 4 years to come up with their version of it. But I remember when I gave it to them and I said, this is ours. This is ours at local level. Where's yours? Where's yours nationally? Where does it sit? Because when we're seeking assistance, what are we seeking assistance from? Because there was nothing. There was literally nothing. But that 4 years was very, very important because it taught me something about the NHS. There are two fundamental issues that face innovation inside the NHS. And the first one is it's a particular NHS disease. It's called not invented here. And what that means is that it wasn't our idea. So why do we want it? Because everyone wants their name on something. They all want to put their name on something. And I'm as guilty as anyone else because I had done that. Only once had I done it because it taught me a lesson. And it taught me a lesson that don't put your name to things because it just makes it harder. And I remember another CCG because we got other CCGs around Wiltshire, so we got Swindon involved. And they picked up the same metrics and started to use the same system. But I remember Wiltshire as a county saying, why are you trying to force us to do this? And I was like, well, I'm not trying to force you to do anything. I'm just presenting something that makes common sense. But they resisted it. They resisted it because they thought it was mine. And it taught me a lesson, which was don't put your name on things. If you really want things to be adopted, don't put your name on things. And that was particularly important when it came to the ambulance response program, which I suspect probably anyone to do with the ambulance response program, other than those people that were on the initial call about how it started, have no idea that I was involved in it. No idea whatsoever, because that was deliberate. But interestingly, it took the same time frame. It took 4 years to introduce. But the reality is that the NHS is a big, complex environment. Very, very complex. And it's one of its downfalls that it's so complex. But this is an equation, and I know we've discussed it, but this is an equation which, if you want to be a leader, this is the most important equation you will ever learn as a leader. Okay? And it's C plus C equals U. And what that stands for is that complex plus complicated will equal unachievable. And if you probably have many examples of it in your own life, in your own business life as a doctor, you will probably see many, many examples of that. You cannot introduce a complicated answer into a complex environment and expect it to work. It doesn't work, which is really interesting, that equation. But it's more important when you flip it around, which is when you start from something is not working. It's unachievable. And if you look at it closely, you will find that you have a complicated solution trying to work in a complex environment, which is almost impossible. So you have to, in a crisis, if you think of disaster response, and I teach disaster response around the world, in a crisis, and disaster response is the top, there is nothing above it. You're not going to find anything above disaster response. You cannot introduce a complicated solution into a complex environment. You can change a complex environment over time, but it takes so long to change it. And it has to be so uniformed in the sense that you have to stay with it. You have to be clear about what you're doing. And that requires leadership. And what you see in the NHS is it's absolutely poorly run, not because of just people in it, because you have this political environment that every 5 years changes, and every 5 years somebody comes up with a new answer, which is the truth is they're never going to deliver it, because 5 years is not enough time to change a complex environment like the NHS. What you have to do is have a leadership that recognizes something really simple is the solution. And the solution is, as I say, quality first. You deliver quality the first time, every time in the patient's journey, measured by the only two people that are important, which is the patient and the clinician. Everyone else, take them out of the room. If they agree that this is quality, and you follow that for every single service line that you have, every single service line inside the NHS, pretty soon you will have one that saves billions of pounds in costs when it comes to replication. It will save billions of pounds in costs when it comes to failure, which I think the last time I saw in the NHS, the last figures I saw was 10 billion a year being for mistakes. And you will be able to see that every single person inside the NHS will understand that, because it's really simple and it's a complex environment, and it will act to change that in complex environment over time. But that's how you deal with crisis.
I think what was coming out really here, I need to address a few things here before we go into the equation and the not invented here problem. I want to first talk about your quality, the way you discussed quality. I think what also came out from your discussion was the early intervention as well, which NHS suffers in a sense that if you go to accident and emergency, which is the most common place where you get the interface of what NHS looks like in terms of the waiting time and all of that. What's your take on that early intervention aspect of getting that care, getting that support within the institution as of now? Does it link itself to the quality bit, or these two stand on their own?
Well, I think if you ask any clinician alone, you as a doctor, okay, so I'm a clinician, you're a clinician. You ask any clinician, they will say to you that the earliest that you can intervene inside a patient's journey, inside a condition, is probably going to deliver much better quality. Think about it as a cancer. It's really obvious. That stands as really obvious. What about cardiac? How long does somebody have to wait until they get a stent? How long do they have to wait to get a diagnosis? How long do they have to wait to get the effective treatment that they need? And then you just expand that out and you look at it across all service lines. It makes absolute common sense that if you intervene as early as you possibly can, the patient gets a better system, the patient gets a better treatment, they get a better response, the country gets a better response. How many people will it take off sick leave? How many people will we stop paying to be sat at home waiting for something to happen? And that comes really from the ethos of dealing with crisis. So when you're dealing with crisis, the one thing that you have to do with crisis is that you have to simplify it. We've talked about that, what that simplification. But how do you simplify it? How do you become in a crisis? So there's a concept known as the event pace. And what that means is that the event itself determines the pace of your response. Good example was COVID. Okay, COVID in itself was what we call a rising tide disaster. Many people looked at COVID originally, including the government, as a public health emergency. It was never a public health emergency. It was a natural disaster. It was something that was, although we can say it was seen because there were supposedly plans in place, those failed. Those plans completely failed at the first contact, completely failed, because they were looking at things like flu. They were looking at things that didn't have the level of impact and particularly the speed of which COVID had. COVID went from and I again teach this, COVID went from, it was happening somewhere over there, somewhere in China. It was happening in somewhere else. And it was novelty. And we look at it and we go, oh, that's novelty. And then all of a sudden it started to spread. The system of travel alone started to help it spread. And we started to realize that actually this thing was not just contained in China, it was spreading. And there was a level of concern. We got ourselves into a level of concern about that. And then it got into the UK. And we suddenly started to realize that we were not protected. Whatever the government was saying, whatever plans they pulled off the shelves in the cabinet office and dusted off that were not fit for purpose and were going to fail anyway. The reality is that we were now. And that goes from concern to anxiety. So we, as a population, started to get really anxious about what was happening. And what happens after anxiety is, and you saw it in the UK, is chaos. And what happens in chaos is that people start to make their own decisions. And the reason they start to make their own decisions is one simple fact. And I teach this to leaders. When do you know that leadership has failed? It's when people start to make their own decisions because they no longer trust in the leadership. And what we saw in the country was people going out and buying. I mean, I predicted most things. I really did predict most things. The one thing I didn't predict was flour, but I predicted most other things. And when I say I predicted it, I watched what was happening. I watched it as a ride in tires. I watched the event pace, and I knew that it was uncontrollable. I knew that it would what would happen, what would come next. So I sent my family out, and I made sure that they understood that they could only buy small amounts and from different shops, because I did not want them to add and start a panic. So, and I remember my family saying to me, my son said to me, he said, "Do you think you've got enough beads?" And I went, "No, I think you're right." And I went back out and purchased it. But I purchased, I saw toilet roll, I purchased things which I knew and stockpiled them quietly, knowing that what was going to come next after anxiety was chaos. And the reason it would be chaos is because our leadership had already failed. And you could see that because the event pace was uncontrollable and they were not with it. They were not with the event pace. So in order to, if you think about it logically, what I mean by event pace, when there's a crisis, the event pace is what is being dictated. The only time that you start to get in front of that event pace is when you become proactive. If you are reactive, you are always behind the event pace. And we were reactive all the way through as a country. Literally all the way through, we were reactive. And it was decisions that were made that recognised the impact on the NHS. And people think that, lockdown was all about lots of other things. The lockdown was about one thing. It was about the impact on the NHS, because the impact of the NHS could not deal with that level of event pace. It just wasn't geared up for it. So when you're dealing with crisis, one of the things you have to do is you have to become agile. As a person, as an organisation, you have to become agile. And people often think, well, agile, what does that mean? It's really simple. It's really simple. You remove the space. You remove the time between us. It's no good inside the NHS writing a letter and waiting 3 weeks for someone to read it to then do something. And the NHS, so far, has made one of the simple biggest mistakes in crisis that you will ever see. The simple biggest mistake in crisis is failure to recognize innovation. As simple as that. Because crisis itself is the melting pot of where innovation really is being tested, really being tested. And if you are geared up to see it, and that's what we try to do in ReThink Crisis, to get people to recognize that don't see crisis as a failure, don't see it as a mistake. You have to recognize that crisis is one of the best opportunities you will ever have to deal with innovation. Good example is, in COVID, if we saw remote appointments, why aren't we having remote appointments anyway? Why aren't we having the ability to be able to talk to someone first time, every time, and get seen, quality first? Why is that not part of our system? And as a commissioner, I've had many people say to me, there's not enough money for the NHS. And I've corrected every single person that's ever said that to me. And what I've said is, no, there's not enough money for this model. That's the reality of it. If you want to continue with this model, you're right. There's not enough money inside the NHS. And it's often being pulled back by politicians who know nothing about healthcare and know nothing about leadership. People that put themselves into these positions who are young. How many disasters have they ever managed? How many road traffic accidents have they ever extricated someone from and saved their life? How many of these people have been in those positions? You look and you'll find none. Absolutely none. Yet they stand in front of us and say, trust me, I know how to fix the NHS. No, you don't. If you knew how to fix the NHS, it would have been fixed a long time ago. But the key, absolutely, 100%, is leadership.
So I want to go back a bit again. Sorry to push you here a bit, but I want to know some of the key dimensions which my audience can take when it comes to the concept of event pace. People who are working in that space, people who are operating in that space, what can they learn from if they have to decode event pace, which you've rightly defined in the correct way? But on my finger, if I tell these are the key dimensions of what event pace looks like, the key characteristics.
So you're a bit quiet, okay, but I think I understand the question, okay. But for me, it's really clear, okay, is that one of the problems that we have in leadership is a failure to recognize our own vulnerability. Okay, so we start from a position of saying, I know the answer. The truth is, if we knew the answer, there wouldn't be any requirement for us to intervene. The reality is that actually no one single person knows the answer. And as a leader, as someone that teaches leadership and someone that's watched leadership, I can tell you that that's fundamental. I can tell you, and I don't know this for a fact, but I can tell you that when Nelson Mandela was coming to the end of his life, he would have realized that one of the major problems of leadership was waiting for a leader, waiting for that one person that's going to solve everything. Because the reality is, that's not the answer. We may have another Nelson Mandela, but how many bad leaders have we got now, and how many bad leaders are we going to have until we can find one? And will they be empowered to make the changes? That's not what we need. What we need is people to be empowered to lead and be empowered within the space that they occupy. When COVID happened, I was asked to go to the Royal Marsden Hospital, and to test their preparation for COVID. I can tell you now that my first reaction was to change their plan, just change it, because I recognised straight away that the plan really wasn't a plan at all. It was a plan that had been devised by people that don't know how to deal with crisis. And one of the things I did was to go back into the Royal Marsden and give a presentation to their senior clinical leads about what leadership looks like in a crisis and how you have to own that space. And the reality of most of what I saw inside the NHS is no different than most of what I see inside organisations, in business, in any organisation. You can pretty much see that it exists. So the NHS is not exempt from those failures that exist around us. And I call them failures because they're failure to learn from them. Because there's no such thing really as a mistake. The only mistake is a failure to learn from it. That's a universal mistake that occurs. But if you want to create something, People have to be empowered to be able to create the boundary that exists in what they see within the area of their scope of responsibility. And if you want to deal with patients better, right across the NHS, you just have to recognise we need to get in earlier, better, better quality. Patient needs to be satisfied, the clinician needs to be satisfied, and every other part that claims to be part of the leadership, like finance and all of those others, they all need to be taken out of the room, because finance is not capable of intelligent design. It's as simple as that. It's not capable. It's only capable of taking advantage of it. But intelligent design does not come from finance. And one of the things I told the Cabinet Office on a telephone conference call at the beginning of COVID, and I told it said, well, was empower the clinicians inside the NHS, because they are your best resource. They are the people that will save the NHS during COVID. It will be the clinicians. It won't be anyone else. It'll be the clinicians who step up and empower them to do so, because they've got the knowledge, they understand, and more importantly, they've got the passion, care. They've got the passion to do it for no other reason than it needs to be done. Does that answer your question? I'm not sure if it does, but
Yes, it does. It does. I'm fascinated by your equation as well, which I want to go into, but we'll come back to it later, because I want to move on to your new project in terms of your Authentic Leaders Institute, because I'm fascinated by the word authentic, and again, it's not a light word to be used, because it's clear that wherever you worked, you had your own ideas, and again, that must have coincided with integrity as well, which is an important aspect of leadership. How did you balance that out? How did you make sure you were true to your own values? And again, this takes us back to our previous question, but then how did you push on when you were faced with such questions around integrity? Again, when we talk about innovation, you're always trying to bring on new things, trying to do different things, and that comes in the way of people who have their own ideas, and then you are trying to be a trailblazer there, trying to change things. So how did you address that?
well, I suppose I have to take it back a little bit, okay? Because the first question really was about the word authentic, okay, which is right. Why is it called authentic? Well, what do you think authentic is? For me, it's really clear. Okay, let's put it like this: we are surrounded by data points. If you look around you now, there are millions of them just in the room that you're in. Millions of data points. We take those data points, and we collate them into patterns, and we call that information. And then we take that information and we create knowledge. But the difference between knowledge and wisdom is really simple. It's values. It's when we take knowledge and we apply values to it. And we're not talking about values that are made up. We're talking about the values that you were born with, the values that you learned in the beginning of your life. When a child is born, a child comes into this shared reality, because that's what it is. Whatever your beliefs are, it's a shared reality. A child comes into this shared reality with unconditional love. Not always. There are a very small percentage of people that don't get that, and for them, I feel eternally sorry for. But the reality is, everyone can overcome that. But they are born with unconditional love, normally from their parents, mainly from their mother. Now, there's an argument to say that your mother, when she gives you unconditional love, that's not purely altruistic, because she wants her genes to survive. She wants survival of the race, survival of the species. But the child doesn't know that. The child doesn't know that there might be other motivations behind this unconditional love. The child is born into unconditional love. And that's where we get our first values from, literally from love. We get our values, and those values become universal values. They become things that we treasure. Things like justice, honesty, the things, integrity, all the things that are universal. That actually, if you stripped away people's political beliefs, and if you stripped away some of their other beliefs, and actually asked people to do a set of tasks, you would find that most people would put their hand out. Most people would help somebody that was lying on the floor. Most people would feel injustice. Most people would seek equality. All of these things are universal. They exist right across the planet. over 8 billion of us, and we've all got them, and they're values. If you want to be a leader and you want to be authentic, the difference between authentic and non-authentic is that you have values. You follow those values. You don't follow what you've been taught in a book. You don't follow what someone tells you to do. You rely on the values that exist inside you, and they exist inside every one of us, and they're universal. So every one of us recognizes these values. When you do that, you are an authentic leader, because you are not following somebody's idea of leadership. You are following your values. And that's what we mean by authentic leadership. Now, often what I've found in my career is that everyone is capable of that. Everyone is capable of leading. Every single person. There's not a single person that I've found that is not capable of leading. It doesn't necessarily mean they'll be a good leader. There are bad leaders and good leaders, but everyone is capable of leading. The difference between us, and I've heard this many times, a lot of people think that we are evolved from the apes. That's what a lot of people think. But that's not strictly true. Actually, what we are is we have a common ancestor with apes and bonobos, a tree-dwelling ancestor. And if you look at those two societies of apes and bonobos, you will see a distinct difference between those two societies. One is quite aggressive. One is tribal. The other one has a different approach. The other one is much more about the individuals within the group. And that, if you look into the evolution of those creatures are amazing. They are absolutely amazing. And we hold the same shared evolutionary path as those two sets of creatures. Both are clearly intelligent. If you look at apes, they're clearly intelligent. We are intelligent. We have a greater intelligence, you could argue, than those two because of our development of our brain. The reality is that the main difference between us and those two strands of evolution is choice. We have the ability to choose. We can decide the environment we live in. We can decide what the values that we have. We can do that because we have choice. That is the greatest evolutionary development that's ever occurred, is the ability to be able to choose. And it comes from the most impressive evolutionary development, which is the human brain. Yet for some reason, we forget that. For some reason, we adopt other people's values. I mean, you only have to see what goes on when it comes to racism to recognise how people adopt other people's values. And the reality of that is that's not your true values. That's not what you were given. It's what you think you've learned. It's what you think you should be doing. It's what you sign up to. But actually, the reality that's something that sits underneath that. And that is that you have universal values that come from unconditional love. And the difference between you accepting those values and not is choice. An authentic leader recognizes that those values are the right values, and the choice that goes with them is your choice. And if you choose to follow those values, you will be an authentic leader. And it really is that simple.
I think that's one of the finest definition of authenticity I've ever heard, and very well put that. But the question here to you is, Dominic, if you are standing in front of the so-called leaders, or you are in a position where you teach them, how do you make them unlearn the sort of leadership which they are accustomed to, or what they see in and around, and especially leadership around performance, which basically goes into their presence and character as they graduate out of that understanding and thinking?
Well, it's a really good question, and it's one of the things that we're ultimately always occupied. So it's not just me. I have people around me, good leaders, people that recognise that that leadership training as it currently stands is very, very poor, very poor. I mean, most of leadership training regurgitates the same types of lessons that have been learned in academic books. You're never really going to learn about leadership in that position because that's just knowledge. That's just knowledge. And knowledge, like I said, is not wisdom. Wisdom is when you apply values to it. But in order to be able to recognize that wisdom, that knowledge has to be tested. You have to be in a situation which gives you those choices and to see how those choices pay out. So one of the things that we are particularly interested in, and it really comes from our disaster response course. So in 2005, when I came back from Kashmir, one of the things that was really evident to me, coming from a ambulance and fire brigade background, was the level of training that people had before they went to the international disasters was not good enough. It just wasn't good enough. And I made my, as you can probably tell, I made my opinion very, very vocal about that. And what we did was we developed a training course for international disaster response, and we taught it in Canada, the US, in the UK, and I think there's 24 courses or something we've taught. I've been, for the majority, I've been a course director. And what we did was we took those lessons and turned them into practical exercises, practical scenarios where people are forced to learn. They are forced to learn those lessons, because the reality is, I can tell you, I could sit here and quote lots and lots of different people, lots of different opinions about leadership models. I can do all of that. By the time I finished, you would have forgotten half of it. That's the reality. You would have forgotten half of it because it's not associated with anything other than information. And if you really want people to learn, if you really want people to memorize something, you have to apply emotion to that lesson. They have to understand through emotion, because emotion builds memories. And one of the things that we teach, and I do, as you can imagine, the leadership element of the course, is that one of the things we teach is that I've been told many, many times, directly or subversively, you've been told that emotion isn't necessarily a good thing. Don't get too emotional. Don't get too emotional. Emotional leadership is not something we want. The truth is that emotions are your biggest strength. They're the biggest thing, because that's what makes us human. Is emotion. Why would we cut off what we fundamentally are? Wouldn't it be better to learn knowing that actually emotion can help us? When I have done some of the things I've done, it's because emotionally I think it's the right thing to do. It's touched me. It's made me feel that something has to be done, because emotionally I recognize my emotions as a good thing. That doesn't necessarily mean that you should use emotions to make every leadership decision that you make, because very quickly you can start to lose your leadership direction. But failure to recognize your emotions is a fundamental error. And we are told, even as a child, be quiet, it's okay, stop crying. The reality is, and it's one of the things that always semi-amuses me as a paramedic, is when somebody is saying to their child, stop that. It's like trying to explain, and I end up explaining to parents that what is the impact of some of the drugs that are now running through that child's body, such as adrenaline and cortisone. And actually, what you think that they can control is not something they can control. The only thing that will allow them to come down is time. And being in a protected environment will allow that to happen. And it's quite strange that you often end up educating the parents about children, not the child, because people have a different idea, because we're taught, don't be emotional, don't cry, stop crying. It's why, if something makes you cry, therefore something is touching you, something is actually touching you. Better to understand what it is that's touching you and why it's touching you. So one of the things that we did on that course was to change the way we teach. And we're currently in development of a completely different leadership course, which really fundamentally builds on that, which is recognizing what we call accelerated learning events. Events that teach you not because of the event itself, because the event is designed to teach you an emotion. It's designed to teach you a memory. So you go through an emotion, and when you go through that emotion, you're very ready to find the answer. You're much more ready to find the answer than if I sat here and quoted numerous leadership models at you. Like I said, you will forget them. And you probably have read some of these leadership models as a doctor, and your own training, your own education. And how many are you using now? How many do you use in your day-to-day interaction with people, particularly with patients? There's a different way to teach people, and it's to recognize that emotions are your strength, not your weakness, and stop following what you're being told. And that's one of the things that we recognise when teaching people, because we had basically people for 3 days. That's all we had them for, 3 days. That's all we could get them on. So we're teaching clinicians, all the way up to, professors, people, neurosurgeons, all the way down to non-clinicians, logistics stuff. And we have to make them function as a team when we've got 3 days. And that is one hell of a task to do. But it's not insurmountable. And we found a way to do it. And the way to do it was accelerated learning events and recognizing emotions were your strength, not your weakness. And once you do that, emotion equals motion with information equals memory.
Thank you for that. Thank you so much. So what would be your message to your business schools, to the organization who big up on leadership training, especially in business schools? Because, I belong to business school where there's so many courses out there which focuses so much on leadership. So how would you redo the whole curriculum talking about authentic leadership, which really means authentic in every sense?
Well, the first thing I'd say, look around you. Okay, just look around you. You don't need me to tell you the failure of leadership. You don't need me to do that. You just have to turn on the news. You just have to look at the politicians that are in position right now around the world. You just have to look at what is happening. You just have to look at the horror. You just have to look at it and recognize there's something fundamentally wrong with the way that we part this information. There's something fundamentally wrong with the way that we empower leaders. I don't need to prove it. I really don't need to prove it. But that's a starting position of recognizing that if something is wrong, something needs to change. And if something needs to change, what is it that needs to change? And as I said right from the beginning, is you need to understand your values. You need to understand that teaching and learning through values is a fundamental thing that we all need to understand. Because 90% of what is happening right now on this planet, in this shared reality, would not happen if that was the case. Just would not happen. Nobody would flick a switch and bomb a child. Nobody would do that if they fundamentally followed the universal values that we all have. So something went wrong. Something went wrong from that position, and we need to take ourselves back to a position of understanding, okay, if something's gone wrong, what is it? What is it that we can then unwind? What is it that we can look back and say, okay, where did it go wrong? And when you look at those universal values that we're all born with, and you look at the process that people go through, where those values are imprinted on them, imposed on them, and you recognize that these values that are being imposed on you are fundamentally changing you as a human being, and that these values that have been imposed are not the right values, and they're not yours, which is more important. And if you start from a position of recognizing that, and then start from a position of recognizing that leadership is not about boundaries, it never was. It's about creating your own. Stepping into a space together, all of us stepping into a space together that hasn't necessarily been created yet. For something to be created, and I'm a great believer in the process of creation. I mean, I would argue that I'm not sure about the speed of light, but with the speed of light, it's the true constant in the universe is creation. It's the thing that drives the whole universe. It's the very act of creation, and we are part of it. And I'm not talking about religious belief. I'm talking about the actual act of creation. And I know that to be able to create something, the first thing that has to exist is the space to be able to create into. The leadership around the world right now has created that space. We can all see it. Now what we have to do is to step into that space differently, and not from the way we've done it in the past. And if somebody tells you they've got the answer, okay, you should look them in the eye and say, well, if you've got the answer, why are we here? Why is it that it looks like this? Because no one person has the answer. No one person has the answer. We all have to step into this space differently and together. And if we step into this space together and recognize the true lessons that have been shown to us, we will find a better way. And that's all we seek, is a better way.
So from your authentic leaders thinking to that institute which you've created, we now come to ReThink Crisis. So everything what you've just discussed is a product of the crisis we are part of at the moment. And we are living in a world where obviously crisis is no longer a sort of an interruption. They've become constant. So you've mentioned all of them, from healthcare to climate to geopolitics. The breakdown is so in front of us. So what I want to explore with you here is, why did you start ReThink Crisis, and why is it that makes your approach very different to all other approaches which are out there?
Well, the first thing is that what you call crisis and what I call crisis really, as a definition, if you think about crisis is the unforeseen. We're not prepared for it. Okay, but you could argue that even if we're seen it, we're not prepared for it, and that's still crisis. And the reality is that what I've been dealing with for many years is other people's crisis. I've been stepping into that space to help them as a firefighter, as someone leading firefighters, as someone leading ambulance staff, as an ambulance staff myself, as a paramedic, all the way through. In every time that I've found that opportunity, there are elements that you could argue a definition is crisis. So if we want to advance, we have to recognise the scale of that crisis. That crisis is fundamentally everywhere. And you could, as I said before, you can measure crisis. You can measure the impact of it. Novelty, concern, anxiety, chaos. You can measure the impact of that crisis. But often, what we do when we talk about leadership is we don't talk about crisis at all. What we talk about in leadership is models. Is this worked here? This worked there. These are tactics that you could use. But actually, if you can lead in crisis, you can lead anytime. So I remember when I was an NHS commissioner, and I put that operational performance management framework on the table. And one of the NHS consultants asked me to go down and visit Kent. And I went down to visit Kent, and they were developing a system where, in a major incident, they were collecting all this information electronically that would allow them, in a major incident, to be able to better serve that incident. So how many beds were available in the hospital and so on and so forth. And I remember I watched the presentation, and I had an opportunity, because I'd been brought in essentially as an external person just to give a view. And what I pointed out to them was that they had got it the wrong way round. What we didn't need was something that told us what the information we needed in crisis. What we needed was that information all the time. And then when there was a crisis, we were better equipped to be able to deal with it. And that became shrewd. That became the IT solution that many systems are using still to this day to recognize the impact and the data that's happening in their system. And that came from that major incident thinking. But all I did was just turn it around and say, if you can deal with it on a daily basis, if you can see it all, if you can see the visibility of the system, when the system's dealing with a crisis, you can see it anyway. And it's that ethos, which is recognizing that crisis can be isolated, but actually crisis is part of day-to-day life. It's part of any system. It's not something that's introduced at one stage. It's part of the natural process of any system is crisis.
So am I right in understanding that how you see crisis is you move away from seeing it just as a breakdown, but more of an opportunity to rethink the entire system altogether?
Well, it's both. So crisis can lead to adverse effects if you don't manage it. Okay, but if you try to manage it, you will fail. If you lead it, okay, if you step in and lead in crisis, that's the difference. If you step in and lead in crisis, you will reduce the negative impact of crisis. You can never really remove it because it's part of the natural process. But if you can lead, you can remove it. But as I've said, the biggest single failure in crisis is to recognise the innovation in crisis. If you think about just cooking something, if you put loads of ingredients in the pan, the magic happens where they all mix. At the edge of what you're doing, that's where the magic happens. And if you can see that magic and recognise it, you can pick out the things from that magic which actually you can take in, which then avoid your possibility of you re-entering that crisis, but more importantly, give you an advantage. So many businesses would have an advantage if they recognise that simple fact is that crisis is the biggest single melting pot for innovation. That's all they have to recognise. But if you're not geared up to see it, you won't see it.
So you mentioned to us earlier, you spoke about one element, the human element, which was beautifully explained in terms of the emotional side of leadership, the emotion, how you use it, how it puts in you that human touch, human element. The other thing when it comes to crisis and leadership is pressure, people under pressure. So how would you look at that in terms of innovation? And again, drilling down to people who are really, like you mentioned, example of what was happening in Kashmir, that pressure element, how do you decode that? How do you define that when you're talking about leadership, especially in relation to your organization, ReThink Crisis?
Well, I mean,
how do you look at that?
I'm no surprise that from a doctor currently in this day and age is talking about pressure, because the NHS is without a doubt one of the most pressured environments, particularly on clinicians. And there is difficulty there. There is real difficulty there. But the first thing you have to do is be honest. Okay, back to those core values. Be honest. I remember I was in a meeting in the Southwest, and the meeting was half clinicians and half commissioners. And I remember talking about stepping into that space that doesn't exist yet, that space that has been created, but no answers are in, and that we need to step into that space together. And I remember one of the clinicians saying, a doctor saying, put his hand up and said, "Are you saying, as a commissioner, you don't have all the answers?" And I said, "Of course, that's what I'm saying. Because if we had all the answers, we wouldn't be here. We would all, there would be no pressure. We would have solved it." And I remember looking around that room, and there were literally half the clinicians in that room, so half the audience was, and every clinician was going and nodding their head, recognizing that statement, recognizing that actually this was about something new, about stepping into a space that doesn't really exist yet. And I remember looking around, and half of them were commissioners, and they were all looking at me horrified, because I basically said we didn't have the answer. And that in itself fundamentally tells you where the problem is that if we sit there thinking that we've got to hide not our failures, but our inability to find the answers, if we sit there and think that that is the most important thing, then we have made a rod for our own backs. We have to be honest. Honesty is one of the things that of universal values. Why can we not say to each other, we don't have all the answers? If we can say that, then at least we stand a chance of finding some answers. But if we pretend we've got all the answers, and there are so many politicians, without going into, because I'm not sure I can get into America already, but, without going into it, there are so many people that are pretending they know the answers, and they don't. That's the reality, they don't. So pressure comes from that recognition in the first place, is pretending. So we have to take the pressure off each other. If I'm in a room with you and we're talking about the problems inside the NHS, I can guarantee you I'll take the pressure off you, because I will make it very clear I don't have all the answers. You don't have all the answers. Okay? It's not about us having all the answers. It's about us finding the answers, at least finding a better than what we've had before, making it better than what we've had before. And that takes the pressure off people straight away. And I've seen that. I've seen that in a room. I've seen that with people. I mean, I used to say to people, as an ambulance operations manager, I used to say to people, I value the NHS really highly. I value the staff really, really highly. But I don't value them above patients. So if you're asking me that you want to do something that's above patients, you're asking the wrong person, because the clue's in the name, public service. I believe that every single person on this planet should be entitled to free healthcare. Every single person should be kept alive. Because if our leaders can't keep us alive, what good are they? So the pressure really sometimes is artificial. It's not real. It's pressure that we have created ourselves, and we perpetuate by perpetuating a system where we don't recognise that we need to find answers together. And I remember when I was a commissioner, one of the things, because I come from the ambulance service, one of the things that so the hospital, quite rightly, said we're having to admit a lot of old age people into the hospital, a lot of elderly people into the hospital, because by the time they get to the hospital, there's no options, there's no service that we can then refer them to get them back. Now, the hospital were talking quite rightly from a bed's perspective, because that meant somebody had to go in a bed. But as a clinician, and with other clinicians, we recognise absolutely that many people, many elderly people, they struggle to survive, but they do. They do survive. They survive in their own homes, a place they want to be. That's where they want to be. And the best way that we can help them is to keep them in that place as long as we possibly can. But there are times when they need support. But one of those supports is not putting them in a bed, because we know that their mobility, where they might have just been able to manage, their mobility goes down drastically the moment we put them in a bed. And if they stay in that bed for 2 or 3 days, they're not the same person that they came in. They're a different person. We are doing them a disservice, an injustice by the way the system is reacting. So what we did was I arranged for a trial, and that trial was to put an ECP, which is an emergency care practitioner, so a paramedic with more skills that can give drugs, antibiotics. Okay, I arranged for one of them to be available to all of the practices in Bath and North East Somerset. So the doctor, having had the call that says, I need a home visit because the patient can't even get to the surgery, that patient was waiting until the surgery was over. So the patients that were phoning up at 8 o'clock or 8:30 to get their appointment, to go and get in, those patients that could walk, they were being seen first. But the patient that couldn't, the patient that had mobility problems, comorbidity issues because of their condition, they were being seen last. And by the time they were being seen, they'd already deteriorated 2 or 3 hours, possibly longer, because they had been seen first. And then by the time a decision was made to take them into hospital for any form of intervention or check or whatever was required, CT scan, whatever it may be, by the time they got into the hospital, there was no route to send them back. There was no route to send them home. There was no service available to send them home. They would then have to be admitted with all of the bed issues that go with that, with all the mobility issues that go with that. So straight away, when we stood back and looked at it, it was obvious there was a problem. So we put this ECP in place, and this ECP's job was to go out on the request of the doctor. So the doctor would say, I'm not happy with this. So I want you to be seen. And I remember some of the feedback where some of these people would be seen by, a car would turn up, an ambulance car, fully marked, and a paramedic would get out and come to their door, and they go, oh, I didn't call an ambulance. They go, no, you didn't. What happened was your GP decided that he didn't want you to wait any longer, so I've come to do an assessment so I can feed back directly to the GP. And that's exactly what was happening. So they would then phone the GP up or arrange a phone call between patients and say, look, this is what I've got, this is what I found, this is what I think, are we in agreement? Sometimes the patient would be transported, sometimes they weren't. But if the patient was transported, it meant they were transported early. It meant there was a chance of getting them home again. But often what was happening is that a decision was being made that they didn't need transporting. And one of the things we didn't realise when we put this in place, and it was the feedback was amazing from the GPs. They were one GP who was known to be quite critical of the CCG and the NHS. I remember that GP standing up and saying it's the best thing we'd ever commissioned. Because the one thing we didn't recognise was the level of anxiety the GPs were holding, the level of pressure, personal pressure that was on those GPs. They knew that these patients needed to be seen. They knew that the patient was more justified to be seen than the person that was in front of them, because this person had made it to the surgery. This patient couldn't even get out of bed. They knew that, and they were holding that level of anxiety, that level of pressure. That didn't need to happen. That did not need to happen. And that's what we learned, is that if you look at it and you take leadership and you look at it differently and you recognise that these decisions are not necessarily obvious, but that we need to work together to find a better way of doing it, you can take the pressure off people. And that's what we found.
I think it's fascinating how you bring the human element into everything as you define when it comes to leadership, and with examples which you've given us. I want to bring this back to our listeners in terms of how they're thinking. Now, not all of them we're talking about as being in high pressure situations, not leading the ways in their own way, but we're talking about day-to-day individuals, we're talking about students, we're talking about would-be entrepreneurs or community organizers, even parents or frontline workers. So what advice would you give based on all your experiences all this while to someone who find themselves leading in a very, very difficult circumstances for the very first time?
Okay, well, the first thing I'd say is if you find yourself in that situation, you find yourself in a leadership position, just remember, okay, that nobody knows all the answers. Okay, nobody. Okay, so don't think that you're going to fail, because there's no such thing as failure. The only failure that really exists is the failure to learn. So you will learn from that leadership experience, and you will enjoy it. Okay, at some point you will look back and look at this and go, actually, it taught me a lot. I learned a lot from that experience. And any environment that teaches you is the best environment that we can find ourselves in as leaders. So recognizing that there is nobody that knows all the answers should empower you to think, well, if nobody knows all the answers, then there are no real boundaries, are there? Don't place boundaries on yourself, and don't let others place boundaries on you. And the best things that I've managed to create is stepping outside those boundaries. And believe me, I'm known as a maverick. Even inside the NHS, even inside as a commissioner, I was known as a maverick, someone that wouldn't comply to the rules. Because what rules? What, somebody's rules? There are no real rules. Okay, leadership creates your own. You create your own space in this reality, and that's it. You create your own space. So step into it. Step into it with gusto. Step into it with the knowledge that actually you can achieve anything you want. I always say there's no such thing as impossible. There's no such thing as impossible. It may be that it's not the right thing to do. It may be that it's not cost effective. It may be that in these circumstances you haven't got the resources, you haven't got the skills, but it doesn't make it impossible. Okay, what makes it impossible is you thinking it's impossible. That's what makes it impossible.
So that's one question. The other level of that question is in terms of you find yourself in that leadership position, which is filled with crisis. But then, what would you advise them to be? What would be your advice for them to be authentic in that situation? Because that's very important.
Okay, well,
based on what your philosophy.
Yeah, it's a good question. If you find yourself in a crisis situation, okay, the one thing I'd say is you do need to understand crisis. I'm not talking about what a crisis is, because, like I said, the definition of crisis could be argued, and there are probably many definitions of it. But actually, the process of responding to it is relatively simple. Okay, we call it the 8R method. All right, which is really around recognizing how to deal with a crisis. Okay, so if you go into your kitchen tonight and you want to make yourself a pizza, and you open the cupboard and there's the flour's gone off, or there's something inside the flour, or you haven't got an ingredient that you wanted, the first thing we teach you is to redefine. Okay, sit there and think about, actually, what was the question? Question the question. I've seen so many people running off and doing things and spending a lot of money, and with teams of people doing it, with innovation as they claim, and lots of people doing this, and they're not actually dealing with the problem. They're dealing with what they think is the problem. So we teach in that 8R method that the first thing you have to do is redefine. Okay, question the question. Was it your objective to make a pizza? Or was your objective to get some nourishment? If your objective is to get some nourishment, why does it have to be a pizza? If you want to eat, does it have to be a pizza? And that question is fundamentally probably the second biggest mistake that I've seen in crisis. is people not questioning the question. It's starting off and thinking they know what the question is, and therefore they know what the answer is, only to get to the end of that process to realise they didn't know at all, because they didn't stop and question the question. So if you find yourself in that position, first of all, really redefine what it is that you're actually been asked to do. What is your aim? Because somebody might tell you this is the aim. And I've had that many times where people say, this is what we're doing. And I'm looking at it and thinking, well, that's not going to put that fire out. You know, it might satisfy you that I followed what you said, that I'm leading the way you want me, but it's not going to deal with the problem. The problem is something else. So let's deal with the problem. And then afterwards, you can tell me off, which is often the case.
So stay close to the question as much as
Always
possible. That'd be a take-home message.
Always.
Yes. All right. That takes us into a quick fire round. This is the last round of the questioning which I have for you. I think I've been throwing a lot of questions at you, but these are simple one word or one sentence answers, and I'll be asking a few of them before we close the session. So my first question in that round would be one myth about leadership which we need to bury in this environment.
Bury. So yeah. A concept or a thinking that you want really to put to bed.
Anything.
Put to bed. Okay.
Yeah, anything around leadership which we have to put to bed.
Right.
Yes.
Really simply, okay, is the difference between management and leadership. Okay. Recognize that you're a leader. Okay. If you're managing within boundaries, you're not leading. You're not leading at all. You're managing.
Okay. Now, for our listeners, if you could recommend one thinker, book, or an idea which has shaped how you lead today in the different roles you've had.
That's a difficult one because I'm not academic. So if you said to me, what books do you read? I'd say to you, God, I'd have to go back to when I was quite young. And maybe I read some Isaac Asimov, and I always thought that I was always impressed by his view of the future. So I'm not sure I'd recommend a book. Okay. What I'd probably say is that you're not going to learn it in a book. Okay. It's not going to come to you in a book. If you think that you're going to learn about leadership in a book, you're probably going to follow the same pathway as probably 99% of all leaders that have ever existed before you. But the lessons are all around you.
That's true. That's very true. And my final question in this round is one value which you'll never compromise on when it comes to leadership.
So again, you were a little bit broken there. So what value?
One value which you will never compromise on when it comes to leadership.
That's a really good question. But I think personally, for me, it's integrity. If you stick to who you are, okay, and you stick to your values, you won't go wrong. No matter what anyone tells you, you will not go wrong.
I'm very tempted to ask you one more question before we close the session, and that would be on a positive note. What is it that gives you any hope at all when it comes to the future of leadership in the current time?
I know that we are capable of more, and it's our thinking that limits our thinking. And when you truly understand that statement and apply it, you'll recognize there are no boundaries. There are no boundaries. We can do better than this in everything that we do, particularly this shared reality.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dominic. That was such an honest and insightful conversation. I've really learned a lot. I'm sure my audience have as well. I mean, what started out in the form of integrity, you spoke about pressure, you spoke about so many different things. And again, you took us from NHS to your own Authentic Leaders Institute and then ReThink Crisis. I can clearly say your work reminds us about, like I started right at the beginning, leadership isn't about performance, it's actually about presence. So to our listeners, if this conversation resonated with you at all, please follow, share, and help us spread the word. to a wider audience. And up until next time, please keep listening, keep questioning, and keep building in the Broken Bazaar. Thank you so much.